Before we start the podcast, I'd just like to let you know that we've recently released Panglot Indonesian. This is an app on Android and iOS for learning the Indonesian language, or Bahasa Indonesia. If you're interested in learning this language using a novel and effective pedagogy, I suggest you check it out. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Panglot World Languages, the podcast where we speak about languages from around the world. Today, we will be having Alexander O'Neill on the podcast again. Previously, Dr. Alexander O'Neill was here to speak about the Newar language from Nepal. Today, we're going to speak about Sanskrit. So just to introduce Dr. O'Neill again, Alexander James O'Neill is an assistant professor at the Department of Liberal Arts at Musashino University, Tokyo. He was previously a research fellow at the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the School of Oriental and African Studies, also known as SOAS, in the University of London. He received his PhD from the University of Toronto's Department for the Study of Religion. He has a broad range of interests, including Sanskrit Buddhist texts, relevant to today, and manuscripts from South Asia, especially Nepal. He has a passion for Newar Buddhism, which we spoke about last time, the Newar language, and Newar culture. In addition, he is broadly interested in Mahayana Buddhism, ranging from Sanskrit and Newar literature to Chinese and Japanese Buddhist texts and practices. So, welcome, Alexander.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be back. Thank you.
Yeah, I should say welcome back, in fact. So after actually reading your introduction for a second time, something struck me, which is that you're interested in Sanskrit and Newar, a lot of that due to the Buddhist literature, but it also mentions Japanese and Chinese, and you're currently in Tokyo. So out of interest, are you actually studying Japanese texts in Japanese?
Yes, some Japanese texts in Japanese. I have proposed a project which will probably go forward in some form, called the Zonkaku project, which is an attempt to translate and produce studies of the works of a, let's say, I think roughly 13th century Buddhist teacher in what's called the Jodo Shinshu tradition of Pure Land Buddhism. And that's something which is using essentially medieval Japanese, but it does require knowledge of Chinese as well. So, yeah, all of these different languages that I work on are related in some way, though it might be hard to guess how. But they are all related.
Medieval Japanese and Newar, I wouldn't have thought so, but
yeah, well, not directly, but essentially, Buddhist Chinese is something which developed through translations of Sanskrit texts and also Prakrit texts. And so Prakrit refers to languages that are related to Sanskrit, but it's closer to the way that ordinary people would have spoken in South Asia and also parts of Central Asia. And Buddhist texts were translated from Sanskrit and Prakrits and Central Asian languages into Chinese, and so there are a lot of terms that are transliterations of Sanskrit in Chinese that don't really make sense syntactically or rather lexically within regular Chinese, and so a lot of those terms we also find in
I'm a Mandarin speaker, and I have encountered in Taiwan a number of Buddhists and sort of Buddhist references. And, you know, unlike you, who is a very deep specialist on these issues, I have the most superficial knowledge, but I do encounter terms like Amitofo and things like this, which that's just onomatopoeia, essentially, in Chinese. Like, you use characters to spell it just so you can spell it somehow, but it doesn't really mean anything because it's just direct loan words, as I understand it, from mostly from Sanskrit. And this is it's quite unusual in Chinese, actually, because there aren't that many modern words that you do that with. There are a few modern words in Mandarin that are borrowed directly from other languages by sound. So like chaokali being chocolate. It's not even immediately obvious that that means chocolate, but there are some words like that, like chaokali. But But yeah, in terms of Sanskrit, I mean, perhaps it was a different stage in the language's development, because historically this was, you probably know better. You certainly know better than I do. But over 1,000 years ago, as I understand, then at that time the borrowings were sort of these sort of direct these sound-based borrowings like you get in European languages, whereas modern Mandarin tends to more often create new words based on the meanings rather than to just directly borrow the sounds. Again, a bit off topic here, but it's just, I thought, an interesting point to point out, the fact that these languages, you wouldn't have thought there's so much contact between 1000-ish AD China and India, because there's a huge, quite well-known mountain range in between that you go somehow across the Himalayas. But actually, through this Buddhist cultural kind of impact, there was some. So just sort of firing off in a bit of a different direction to where I thought we'd go to start with. But that's interesting, because I also wanted to ask you, just, this isn't perhaps slightly more personal, but basically, what languages do you know? This might be, it's a kind of a secondary aim of the podcast for me, is to highlight to people that it's possible to know multiple languages, that it's not, because most people listening to this podcast, they typically will have around them people who speak one or two languages, maybe three, but then it is, it's conceivable to speak many, and it's, some people go on the internet to talk about how great they are because they can speak a bunch of languages. But I think if somebody puts in the time and the dedication, or if they grow up in a society where it's normal to speak multiple languages, then that's that's something not everybody is aware of, that there are some places where people speak 4 or 5 languages and that's a normal thing. So I want to bring that to people, partly using this podcast. So it's a bit of perhaps you're a little bit of an unusual case, but I'm just interested in what languages you speak or use or read.
Yeah, sure. Well, I got into Sanskrit as an undergraduate. But I started with well, my second language, because I grew up in Canada, was French, but my French is not very good. But the first could say third language, I suppose, was Latin as an undergraduate, and having that background, understanding the structure of a classical language like that, with declensions and complicated systems of conjugations, really helped with Sanskrit. So in my third year as an undergraduate, I started with Sanskrit, and I think in my fourth year as an undergraduate, I started with Pali. And around the same time, I also started to dip my toes into Chinese. I never really got that far with the Mandarin. I managed to get to a point where I could speak everyday phrases, get around. If I went around town in Taiwan, I visited Taiwan several times, but I couldn't have a deep conversation. But then in my graduate studies, I started to get into Buddhist Chinese and reading Chinese texts very much like a classical language in that sense. So it's not really conversation material. It's rather esoteric in that sense, and sometimes literally incantations and what have you, which are transliterated from Sanskrit. Yeah, exactly.
Words.
Yeah, grimoire and so forth. So yeah, and then I also started to focus on Nepalese Buddhism. That was my area of specialty as a doctoral student, and so I started with Nepali and Newar as a master's student, and then continued working on those as a doctoral student. And now I do speak Japanese, and I deliver courses in Japanese as well. And essentially, I started to work on Japanese after I knew I would be working in Japan. So it's the newcomer. But in terms of, just because of necessity, in terms of my conversational ability, my Japanese is my strongest second or third language. I can't really hold a conversation in Sanskrit or Latin, but I know there are people who can.
There are people who do. Yeah, we'll talk about that shortly.
Yeah,
So we got English, French, or French kind of at least, Latin, Sanskrit, Pali, medieval Chinese, Nepali, Newa, and Japanese. It's a very unusual set. It's not, it's very personal to you. But I was going to say,
yeah,
look, guys, most of these are from when you started from after when you started your undergraduate. It's not like you were exposed to them as
yeah.
children. So, as a child, sorry.
Well,
So, look, guys, you can learn like these random languages if you want.
yeah.
So,
Let me actually add to that because this is a very good point that you make. I I had my Chinese was very bad. I was very embarrassed with my Chinese knowledge about
mm,
let's say about 7 or 8 years ago, and I was having a conversation with a scholar, a published scholar, very well known scholar of Chinese Buddhism, who also works on Korean Buddhism, and he said he didn't start classical Chinese or actually any Chinese until he was, I think he said 32, and now
mm,
he's he's one of the worldwide authorities on the topic, and that
mm.
really encouraged me. So
Yeah.
yeah, for
Well,
sure, you
these
can get
myths,
started.
they need dispelling. I know today we're mostly talking about Sanskrit, but it's a good opportunity to say, like, again, of course, you can't do it if you don't put in some effort into doing it. But if you want to, you don't have to be you don't have to have the flexible mind of a 10-year-old to learn a language. You can be in your 30s and end up being the world's authority, as it turns out, on one of these. So just want to share that as a piece of inspiration for some people. But we've already encountered now, just from what you were saying, a number of terms that kind of need definition. We need to kind of separate a few things from each other. You mentioned Prakrit, you mentioned Pali. These are languages I don't think everybody will know. So let's get a grip on what's the difference between Sanskrit, Prakrit, what's Pali. We also need to just sort of define who spoke in the past Sanskrit. Where were they? When are we talking? Was there any variability we need to understand over geography or time? So could you give us a bit of an introduction about that?
Certainly. So Sanskrit is an Indo-European language. That's to say, it's part of a larger family of languages that are found throughout Eurasia. The
So that
origins
includes
of this,
English as well. So
that's
it's
right,
distantly
yeah.
related to English. Yeah.
And so, yeah, this spans, yeah, much of Eurasia, and the original, yeah, the original homeland of the Indo-European language family is something that's been disputed, um, but at some point it split. And on the one hand, we have the European branches from which we get Latin, the Romance languages, Greek, Russian, and of course English. Much further down along the line, English is a fairly recent development. And then on the other hand, we have the Indo-Iranian branch. So on the one hand, there's the Iranian branch, which became Avestan, the old language of the Persian religion, Zoroastrianism. And then the Indic branch, we have essentially a term that is Indo-Aryan. Some people may have heard the term Aryan before in terms of racial theories, but in this sense, it's a Sanskrit term that refers to it essentially refers to the people who were speaking the the Indic branch of the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European families. And within this branch, there are lots of different languages. So at the earliest level, what we can talk about is Vedic Sanskrit, and this is not quite the same as what became classical Sanskrit. So when people think of classical Sanskrit literature, they often think of epics like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, the story of Rama. In the Mahabharata, it also this is a massive epic which contains probably the most well-known Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, which
Mm.
features Arjuna and Krishna. It's the source text of Vaishnavism. the branch of Hinduism which focuses on worshiping Vishnu.
Right.
Now that's classical Sanskrit. Much earlier, before then, was Vedic Sanskrit, and this was spoken by the Indo-Aryan people as they entered northwest India, and they used this language primarily for ritual purposes. So it was a liturgical language, and many grammatical forms that we see within Vedic Sanskrit are no longer, they're kind of vestigial by the time we get to classical Sanskrit, because they had
Right.
particular ritual usage or ritual purposes. So, for example, there are two kinds of verbs. Roughly, there's a very large division between verbs in Sanskrit. Some of them are both, but essentially, on the one hand, we have verbs which are called parasmaipada, which means essentially these are
That's the word
verbs
in
that are other.
Sanskrit, parasmaipada.
That's right. These are
Yeah.
verbs that are other related. They're
Mm.
related to actions of verbs, which are done towards objects other than the agent,
Right.
that are done to other people, other things. And then the other form is atmanepada, which are verbs referring to the person doing the action. And so, for
It's
example,
interesting. It's got the word Atman in there that has some religious, I know that has some
yeah,
philosophical and religious connotations, that word Atman. But anyway, please continue.
so atma means self in Sanskrit, atman.
Right.
And so atmanepada, these are actions related to the self. So for example, in a Vedic sacrifice, they in a description or instruction within the Vedas, it might use the atmanepada form to talk about what the priest does for his own benefit. For example, so he
Mm.
will offer an oblation into the fire, sacrificial fire, for his own benefit. So this is something which is very important in Vedic Sanskrit, but which drops away in classical Sanskrit. And then another important feature of Vedic Sanskrit are accents. And classical Sanskrit doesn't use accents. It just has a difference between long and short vowels, so strong and weak vowels. So, for example, an example of this would be a and So is like a schwa, this
Right.
kind of bass vowel.
English uses a lot
Yes,
as a vowel.
exactly. So and then there's which is strong, and this is written in romanization with an a with a macron above it. And so many people who have
Right.
seen Sanskrit transliterations will have seen that. And so
Yeah.
this is something which we find in both Vedic and classical Sanskrit. But Vedic Sanskrit has accents, which are very important for pronunciation, and this is important for ritual purposes in order for the ritual to be effective.
Oh,
But
okay. You need
the
to say the words the right way
yeah,
for the ritual. Yeah.
and, so the Vedas, there are various types of Vedas, but essentially it consists of a lot of incantations, which we call mantras, and
Mm.
these have to be recited in the proper way. And so the Vedic scriptures, the Vedas, they were transmitted orally by brahmanas, or in English we often say Brahmins, and these are priests. And so it was an elite language. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to, because this is a lot of information so far. There's one thing I want to highlight, to make sure that it's clear, is that the thing. So we're talking about two types of Sanskrit: the Vedic Sanskrit and the classical Sanskrit. And I think something that is easy to miss is the really big time gulf between, which I'm sure you can tell us exactly how long we're talking. But what strikes me as a potential analogy, please correct me if this is not the right analogy, but something like French and Latin. Like if you had like a medieval priest using Latin, that's kind of like from my kind of guess of the, that is might be analogous. Someone using classical Sanskrit is like medieval French in that environment, and Vedic Sanskrit is like Latin. Like they're literally speaking what to some extent feels like a foreign language because it's such an old version. Because again, something that I haven't gone in depth with on this podcast, but we're going to need to talk about historical linguistics and how languages change. Not everybody is aware that there's a continuous line of development that links, for example, French to Latin. Like Latin gradually changed over many centuries and eventually became French, and also eventually became Spanish through like a different branch. So this is what we're talking about with historical linguistics. And we've got something similar, as I understand, going on here. And this liturgical aspect also is kind of similar, that you want to, I mean, before the Second Vatican Council or whatever it was called, the one in the 1960s, where they changed the liturgical language from Latin in the Catholic Church, from Latin to not non-Latin, basically vernacular languages. Then, I mean, I don't know exactly what people's attitudes were to Latin in, say the first half of the 20th century, but certainly my understanding is that in the Middle Ages you use Latin partly because it has this kind of magical quality, and there are some languages that do this. I think it's a very interesting linguistic thing it's almost like a different register. So register is a linguistics term to mean like sometimes you speak formally, sometimes you speak informally, and you would use different words. And here it's like you speak kind of magically. It's like you use these words and you use them in a particular way because you want them to have their kind of spiritual or otherwise kind of not sort of supernatural, I suppose, effect. So my understanding is that there's an analogy here between the Catholic Church in, let's say, or it could equally well be medieval Spain, where they're speaking essentially two versions of Latin, right? Medieval Spanish being like a more modern version of Latin, and then like ecclesiastical or classical Latin in the church. And I understand that the Vedic and the classical Sanskrit is a kind of analogy to that, and that, you know, when you say this is past, that they have to use these weird bits of grammar, well, it's a similar thing you'd have to do if you speak Latin in church. And so I imagine I'm just saying this to help in case some people are getting lost in all this stuff they've never heard of, to think like this is kind of potentially an analogy that can help ground your understanding of what's going on. Is this a fair analogy, or am I going way outside of what's reasonable?
Uh, yes, it is a fair analogy. In fact, if you specialize in one branch of literature of classical Sanskrit, the kind of vocabulary and also sometimes the grammar that you're exposed to is specialized to that branch of literature. So, for
Mm.
example, I specialize in Buddhist literature, and so even if I read kavya, which maybe we'll talk about later, which is poetry, poetics, a high uh, belles lettres. The kind of vocabulary and grammar used in those two different kinds of Sanskrit are sufficiently different that if you are not continually reading uh, or well trained in both of those kinds of Sanskrit, you won't be able to keep up with what's going on in these texts.
Mm.
The vocabulary and the grammar is often very domain specific. So
Mm.
there are some very highly technical, and we'll talk about the kinds of literature that exists in classical Sanskrit, but there's a lot of highly technical literature which has very particular vocabulary that isn't shared with, let's say, Buddhist Sanskrit or poetic Sanskrit. And so
Yeah.
even so looking at the Vedas, yeah, it's a very different domain of vocabulary and also grammar. But
So the
yeah, I
analogy
think
holds essentially here
indeed,
on that
yes.
level. It sounds like, because if you wanted to know, I don't know, let's say medieval French, you wouldn't expect having learned medieval French to be able to read Latin. I mean, maybe it would help you to sort of eyeball some of it, but mostly you'd be like, I don't know what's going on. This is a different language. This is what we're using the word Sanskrit to describe both of these, effectively both of these languages. I mean, to some extent, you could say both of these historical periods of one language, but in any case, the difference is so vast. It's like, again, imagine the difference between modern English and Shakespearean English, or better than that, modern English and Chaucerian English. If you've ever tried to read Chaucer, I think more people have encountered Shakespeare than Chaucer, but if you ever tried to read Chaucer or Beowulf or something, that's English too, but it's just like, there's no way you're going to understand that unless you have spent some time knowing more about what English used to be like.
Yeah,
So it's a similar-ish situation. I just wanted to highlight that for people to understand the analogy.
yeah, it might. Yeah, it's probably something very similar to. You'd probably have the impression of something a bit more akin to reading Middle English, as a
Mm.
modern English speaker, because
Middle English being
you
Chaucer,
can
right?
exactly, yeah,
Yeah.
because old English is probably a little bit too different from modern English. But for example, when I have a look at a Vedic verse or hymn, uh, it it's somewhat comprehensible, but I would need some specialized dictionaries to really
Mm.
get an accurate understanding of what's going on. So you have to use a
Mm.
different dictionary if you're reading Vedic, for example, than if you're reading classical Sanskrit.
Could you give us a sense of time, like when roughly are we talking with Vedic, and then when roughly we're talking with classical Sanskrit?
So Vedic was transmitted orally. So we actually don't have written records of Vedic from the time
Oh,
that we believe that it was being spoken. And so this is something which is essentially conjecture, but the mainstream hypothesis on this is that Vedic developed into its it solidified into a definite form in the second millennium BCE. So essentially 4,000 years
the
ago
Bronze
from
Age.
now.
This is like
Yeah.
this is really old. This is like pyramids era
Yes.
kind of thing. I mean,
Yeah,
like referring to
exactly.
Egypt, but like yeah, it was super long ago anyway. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
classical?
So Vedic Sanskrit developed in the next if we consider, let's say, 2000 BCE to be when when it took on some kind of definite form, it took about another 1,500 years to become what we now refer to as classical Sanskrit. And
So
so
that is contemporaneous with, you know, like, well, slightly
Socrates,
before, like, it's like Socrates, basically. I was going to say slightly
yes,
before Socrates, but around that time. So we're talking
yeah, Confucius,
Socrates era
Socrates,
for classical Sanskrit, roughly, and we're talking roughly like building pyramids era for
yeah,
Vedic. I mean, I think it's also easy for people to miss that there's literally 1,500 years in the middle. I mean, it's like sometimes you forget, like, whoops, that's a long time, like 1,500 years. And yeah, one thing that I only really understood now that you've elaborated more is this thing about the priests transmitting it orally. So what you mean, what I understand now, is that this is a language that no longer was actually really in use. It was essentially fossilized in their special kind of like rituals that they have. So they have their rituals, and then they had to use this old form of their language, and they managed to preserve it. And this is actually miraculous. They managed to essentially preserve a form of their language for 1,500 years. It's as if, I mean, but without writing it down. It's as if, you know, it's as if people were speaking nowadays, I don't know what, like Vulgar Latin or Old Church Slavonic or something. Just like, but without ever having seen it written down, just, you know, they just speak this sometimes because they need to do a certain kind of ritual. That's kind of amazing because the number of generations there is, um, I don't, it's big. It's like in the like it's like 50 generations or something. I can't do the maths in my head, but and it's all being transmitted. So there must have been a very serious culture of memorizing, um, exact wording in order because it's very hard to transmit over 2 generations, let alone over 50.
yeah, and essentially to be considered a learned person, probably depends on the region, but to be considered a learned person at the time would be essentially synonymous with knowing the Vedas. So we see
But they're
this,
really long. They're really long. So you have to
they're quite
memorize them.
long, yeah. Well, Brahmins or Brahmanas, priests, would definitely have to have them memorized to that extent. Um, and then other uh, so in terms of what Vedic society looked like and who was learning Sanskrit and who was using Sanskrit, it seems like the Brahmana caste were using it, and perhaps depending on the region, perhaps also the Kshatriya caste, the princely caste of
Were they also
rulers.
the warrior class?
Exactly, yeah, the warrior
Yeah.
caste. So we see this referred, the Buddha is said to have known the Vedas, although he was from the Kshatriya caste. And there's also a difference between what happened as the Indo-Aryan civilization moved further east. So in the northwest, we have a kind of Vedic which essentially focused on the oldest of the Vedic scriptures, which is called the Rig Veda, and this is the oldest Sanskrit, or it's really Vedic, but usually if you see descriptions of Sanskrit, they'll say the Rig Veda is the oldest Sanskrit scripture.
Mm.
And as this civilization expanded and moved along the Gangetic Plain, the Ganges
Mm.
River basin, it coincided with the development of urbanizations, and particularly in what's referred to as the Magadha region in northeast India, which is roughly around modern day Benares, Varanasi.
Mm.
Um, that's a place which many people might know,
Mm.
closer to Bangladesh,
Mm.
the east side of India. Around that area was a region called Magadha. And in that region, all of the Vedas were known, but practice focused more on the Atharva Veda, which is a later Veda that focuses a lot more on mantra recitation for apotropaic purposes, which means essentially reciting mantras for magical effects, um, concern with spirits, and so forth. And in this
Uh,
region, yes, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, does anybody still do that? Does this survive till today, the idea of
Yes,
reciting Vedic sort of incantations for magical effects?
definitely. Yeah.
So in a
It's
sense,
an
this is
everyday thing.
literally a 4,000-year-old
Yeah.
tradition. I mean, you're gonna be hard pressed to find any other 4,000-year-old thing anywhere in the world. I mean, that really is
Um,
incredibly consistent to hold that together. I mean, that must be some sort of record.
well, the only other equivalent would be Zoroastrianism,
Mm.
which is the ancient Persian religion,
But
which
not
is
quite
also
as old.
from
I don't
this.
believe Zoroastrianism comes from the Bronze Age, or I'm not sure if I got it right, but I thought it was from around
I
one that ish.
Yeah,
Still,
it
is
might not be
numbers
as
in the
old.
thousands, but
Yeah, it's quite old.
yeah. Mm.
So then, how did classical Sanskrit develop? Well, we originally there were just the Vedas in terms of literature that we know of being that old. And then essentially what developed were commentaries on the Vedas over time. And as these were written over time, these include texts such as the Upanishads. Many people have heard of the Upanishads, and they're also terms called or texts called the Brahmanas.
Mm.
And there are other kind of commentaries and expansions of the Vedas, and
Mm.
these are also considered Vedic scriptures, but the
Mm.
kind of Sanskrit becomes closer and closer to classical. And then essentially roughly around the time of Alexander the Great, so
Mm.
this is third or a fourth, early fourth century before the Common Era.
Mm.
I think he entered India in the northwest of India in the 300 and might be wrong about this, but 320s before the Common
Something like
Era.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, around that time is when a ancient linguist called Panini wrote
Mm.
a text called the Ashtadhyayi, which
Mm.
describes the grammatical structure in a very complicated way. But he describes the grammatical structure of classical Sanskrit, and that
Yeah.
essentially is considered the start of classical Sanskrit. So,
Uh, and
yeah,
the start of linguistics. I mean, I think was he
maybe
one of
so.
the first linguists in history ever? I believe
At
I
least in
understand him
South
to be
Asia,
one of the
yes,
first linguists in history.
yes.
Because I think, I mean, that's another thing is that it's perhaps a reflexive common understanding among many people that basically Western Europe is where all kind of intellectual developments were ever, right? I don't know, like, I mean, that's a bit exaggeration, but I think some people kind of have roughly that sense because of the scientific revolution. They kind of extend that to everything. But, there's a lot of mathematical achievements, for example, that come from India, which is a bit of a separate topic. But the idea of linguists, linguistics only really got going in Europe quite a lot later, as I understand, compared to, for example, in India and in Korea as well. As I understand, they had they made their own. They redesigned their own alphabet using linguists in the 14th century. So it's something I think is worth highlighting that it's not just 19th century Germans who really got into linguistics. But anyway, yeah. Panini. He's actually spelt the same as the sandwich or the bread, panini, but
Yes,
you're supposed
the
to say it panini.
plural. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah. So, what could you tell us some more about panini?
Well, I'm not really an expert on Panini, but I can say that he was apparently eaten by a lion.
Okay.
Yeah. Uh, but so essentially what he does is he describes different forms, different Sanskrit forms, usually using very, very short words that he invented to describe these. So, for example, if you were to study Sanskrit these days in the West, you would probably learn it using the Latin vocabulary, the grammatical vocabulary. So, for example, we have different conjugations. We have,
Mm,
well, of course, we just use the English present tense, past tense for those. But
mm.
there's also the
Yeah, that's a Greek.
optativus.
Ancient Greek has
Yes,
that as well.
ancient
Yeah.
Greek, exactly.
Yeah.
So, so Panini would have a very short syllable to represent that form, and I can't remember many of them, but some examples are lert,
Mm.
lit. These kinds of very short syllables, which don't mean anything other than these grammatical forms, and
So,
he
so
expresses these
essentially,
in
he had
yeah.
it's like he
Sorry.
had a slightly different sort of structure to his understanding of the grammar, which people coming from from Europe would tend to overlay like a sort of like a Latin/Greek set of analysis on top, whereas obviously he was coming from a
Yeah.
different place. So I suppose, actually Arabic linguists, I just came to mind as another thing that was a big
Mhm.
thing. Arabic linguistics was big because of, my knowledge on this is close to zero, but as I understand, it's something to do with wanting to understand sort of define the language of the Quran and so on. So yeah, I suppose depending on which languages you're coming from, it will influence how you view another language. So is that what you're referring to here, that he had kind of like a different perspective because of that?
Yeah. Well, I would also say that because Sanskrit is an Indo-European language, most of the terms that we use to describe Latin and ancient Greek work quite well for Sanskrit.
Okay.
There are also forms which we find in common, and we don't have to explain this what these are here, but because
Mm.
it's getting it would be
In the
too
weeds.
specific. But yeah,
Yeah.
but for example, there's the locative absolute, the genitive absolute. These are things that we find in I believe in ancient Greek and also in Sanskrit, which
Mm.
which is which is because they're probably because they're from the same family.
Yeah. So I feel like you might be going in a direction. I don't want to interrupt too much, but I feel like this might be a good moment to speak about the relevance of Sanskrit in the history of linguistics, starting from the 19th century, because Sanskrit was a really important. It kind of opened the door to, in a way, the entire field of the modern field of linguistics that we have. So, because of, and I can't remember the linguist names, but some linguists in the 19th century realizing, as you're now mentioning several times, realizing that there's so much similarity between ancient Greek and Sanskrit, and that doesn't make much sense, and Latin also, Latin, ancient Greek, and Sanskrit. There's loads of similarity, and you wouldn't have predicted. I mean, between Latin and ancient Greek, okay, they have a lot of historical interaction. You might have lots of reasons why that could happen. But between ancient Greek and Sanskrit, really, there was barely any interaction. I mean, at most you had, Alexander the Great, as you mentioned, but it's not like they had some massive deep interaction. And actually, pre-Alexander the Great, you even have more similarity. It's not that they became more similar over time. It's like the further back you go in time, from way before Alexander the Great, then you had, you had lots of similarity between these languages, and then they were trying to explain why is there so much similarity, and they had to come up with this idea of linguistic evolution that you mentioned earlier, Proto-Indo-European. So this is, I want to actually do a separate podcast episode on this in more depth. But just the idea that actually there's this whole family of languages that they all come from one ancestor that we have no actual records of, but we can derive that it must have existed. There was originally this one language where other languages kind of developed in the same way how you had from English, so Old English is kind of a bit more similar to Old Norse, or a bit more similar to, or like, I don't know, let's say medieval French and medieval Spanish are more similar to each other than modern French and modern Spanish, because they kind of they changed over time, but they changed in different ways. But if you go back more and more over time, eventually you get back to actually Latin, which is where they come from. And you can do this. So you can do this with other languages. If you take Latin and Greek and go backwards in time, you eventually get to a point where they were one language and they split from each other in time. And it turns out you can do the same with Sanskrit. And if you do it with all these different languages and lots of, basically almost all the languages of Europe, and many of the languages in Iran, in India, and so on, then you come back to a single point of origin, which is called Proto-Indo-European. I mean, that's a very short version, and I want to talk about it in more detail in future with somebody else. But I think it's just worth mentioning, and perhaps you can add some commentary that I've missed here, but it's worth mentioning the significance of Sanskrit for that period of the development of linguistics as a field, that there were some European linguists who realized this can't be a coincidence. Like, how come Sanskrit is so similar to ancient Greek? Especially as you go further back in time, they're more similar. There is something going on here. And there was a kind of sexiness to evolution as a theory at the time because of Darwin. It's, people in the late 20th century maybe would have physics envy. People would want, I want my field, I want whatever it is, sociology, I want political science to be like physics, because physics is so cool, because they can measure everything very precisely and use mathematics to define everything they do, and that's physics envy. But then you have kind of biology envy in the 19th century of like, oh, isn't it cool? They got this big theory of everything, evolution, and then the idea that you can have an analogous theory in linguistics of linguistic evolution. It was really exciting to people, and it really was a kind of boon to the field to think like, oh yeah, we can be sexy like biology is now with their new amazing theory of evolution, and very controversial theory of evolution. So that was me actually providing this context, but I think it's worth adding. But I don't know if you have any other things you'd like to add to my rather long comment here about that.
No, I think that sums up the picture quite well. I mean,
Mhm.
I can give some examples of these similarities with
Yes,
Sanskrit.
please do.
And one of the linguists who you might discuss in that future podcast might be William Jones.
Mhm.
William Jones, who was one of the first to break ground in this field, and also published some fantastic translations of classical Sanskrit poetry. So, for example, the English mother
Mhm.
in Sanskrit is mater, and
Mhm.
in ancient Greek is mater, and Latin
And
mater.
mater in Latin as well.
Exactly.
There
Yeah.
you go. How come they all got
And
the same word for mother, right? That's just,
yeah,
you wouldn't think it's a coincidence, right? Yeah.
and father, pater, uh, Peter
Mhm.
in Sanskrit, and brother, brater.
Mhm.
Sister, svaser, um,
Mhm.
and so forth. Another interesting
Yeah.
thing is some Sanskrit terms are actually closer to English because of the Germanic connection than they are even to uh, Latin and Greek. So, for example,
You just said the word for sister, and I understand that the sort of Old English for sister was
uh,
suesor.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
And
Svesor.
you just said like Svesor or something for, I just
Yeah,
missed it, but yeah.
and
So that's
so
very similar.
cow. Well,
Mm,
cow uh, is in Old English was ku, and
mm,
in Sanskrit is gao.
mm.
Gao.
Very similar.
And but the Romance is it comes from uh, bos, the Latin bos. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, bovine, is that related? Is that from that Latin root?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well,
Yeah,
so
the Romance.
can you count to 5 or count to 10 in in say, well, either
Um,
whichever Sanskrit you prefer,
yeah,
or
it's
count to
it's a
5
little bit.
maybe.
It's a little bit. That's a little bit different, but if you know other Indo-European languages, you might notice the similarity. So one, eka. Eka doesn't sound much like any other European languages, but
Isn't the Greek ek? I thought it was ek in Greek.
yeah, maybe so. Yeah, I never studied ancient Greek, but
Yeah,
number two is dva. So that's
that's which is the same as
yeah,
like every Slavic language in the modern world.
exactly.
Right?
Yeah, and
It's just
two,
so similar. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and then three, tree.
Right. Yeah, just
Yeah,
very very similar.
um,
Yeah.
four, chatur, chatur.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah, it's like quattro. It sounds.
exactly.
It's almost
Yeah,
like it's Italian or something. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
and
So very very similar.
five, punch or puncha. Um,
Mm.
yeah, a little
There's
bit.
pięć in
Uh,
Polish, for example.
okay, yeah.
Yeah,
So there you go.
there you
And
go. Yeah.
actually, I think the Slavic languages are perhaps the closest of the European languages
Mm.
to Sanskrit. So
Well,
yeah,
funnily
if you speak
enough,
a
I mean, there's
Slavic
one.
language,
I know one cognate. So cognate, actually define what cognate means. So a cognate is a technical term meaning when two words come from they were originally the same word and they've just changed in their sound over time. So, for example, this
yeah,
what was it, calf versus cow, right? Sanskrit calf and English cow were originally something like
gao,
8 to 10,000
yeah,
years ago in Proto-Indo-European. They were one word, and then just like English people, well, as a simplification, English people went west, and Sanskrit speakers went east. Like, or people who would become those people went west and east, and started changing the way they said those words. But originally they were the same word. So there's a cognate which amazes me. This cognate between Polish and Sanskrit, which is in Polish we have words budzić się, which is a or budzić actually. You can use budzić. Budzić means to wake someone. So budzić się means to wake yourself because się is reflexive. So budzić means to wake, or like you have a word like budzik, which is an alarm clock. It's literally like a thing that wakes people. Budzik. Now, Bud is actually cognate with Buddha,
yeah,
like the awoken one. So, like, literally, my alarm clock, Budzik, is like, I just found that so. It's such an amazing connection,
yeah.
when it's quite exciting
Boudica,
sometimes when you go like, what? How is that
yeah,
connected? This very everyday thing that we have in the house, and then this sort of kind of it's got a very different aura, right? The concept of Buddha and like sort of very exotic, but they come from the same word. They come from the same root in the past, and that's really amazing to me. Also, the in Sanskrit transliterations, as I understand, into Latin script, then you often use the s with a dash, like to say like Shri, the meaning like holy, as I understand, Sri Lanka, this holy, whatever Lanka means, right? So this should, S with a dash, is in my name, Stash, right? That's because, and the reason apparently that linguists chose to use S with a dash like that is because the specific articulation, phonetic, pronunciation of Polish sh is like pretty it's like more or less identical to the Sanskrit pronunciation, because the Polish sh is different from English sh, is quite subtle. You have to kind of listen very closely to hear the difference. But I can certainly, as a bilingual native in Polish and English, I can certainly hear the difference like night and day between sh and sh. So the exact quality of that sound in Polish happens to be reflect like similar to the Sanskrit one. So that's why they use that letter in the transliteration.
yeah. Uh, Yeah,
Anyway,
probably.
that's just like a random
Um,
fact.
so
But
the
we haven't.
yeah.
Yeah, so please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say. So I should. This is something which I think might be helpful. Um, in terms of transliteration, there were various kinds of transliteration, but the one that has become standardized is called IAST, which is something like the International Association for Sanskrit um,
Teaching.
transliteration, something like that. I'm not sure,
Yeah.
uh, but but yeah, they decided that yeah, this is the best way to write the this, I
To
probably pronounce it
particular
the
sound.
English way. Sha. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
sorry.
yeah. I mean,
But there's another
Polish.
one.
I mean, again, I'll have a podcast
Mhm.
episode on Polish at some point.
Oh, right.
Polish has the distinction between sh and sh. So
Oh, right.
for non-Polish speakers, those two sounds are like
Fair enough.
barely. I mean, who can tell the difference? But for a native speaker like me, they're so different. I'm like, how could you possibly consider them to be the same? It's a funny thing about language. When you have a native language, you're like, I don't understand how you could possibly feel like those sounds are in any way similar. But then, for non-native speakers, it's like you're just saying the same thing twice. That you can't hear the difference between sh and sh. It sounds really similar to people.
Well, Sanskrit has another sibilant, one of these S letters, and that's
Mm.
sha. Sha. It's
So it's a bit
retroflex.
retroflex, like putting your tongue
Exactly.
backwards in
You
your
put the
mouth.
tongue back. I'd probably do it too much, but sha.
Sure,
It's
sure.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that we put the
And
dot
so
on under the S, I think.
you put the dot underneath. That's right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, we started off with a couple of other sort of languages mentioned that we haven't unpacked, just to define what we're talking about to some extent. So Prakrit, you made a brief mention of, but also Pali, because I understand Pali has a lot of. Well, I mean, you can enlighten me here, but I understand Pali and Sanskrit have somewhat of a similar role in terms of literature in the later in a kind of classical-ish period, whereas, because the Vedas are, please again correct me, but as I understand, the Vedas are relevant mostly to Hinduism, whereas the classical Sanskrit, you start getting more Buddhist literature. I hope I didn't get that wrong. But Pali, as I
Yep.
understand, also you get Buddhist literature. So, but also linguistically, there's some kind of relationship here. So, what do we have when? Because we also mentioned that Prakrit is like the sort of more normal, quote unquote, normal spoken, like the thing people would actually speak, whatever it was, 2000 or so years ago, 2,500 years ago, they would actually speak Prakrit. But then presumably classical Sanskrit was spoken at some point. It was also a kind of like more recent, it was like a stage in the development of Sanskrit as well. So do you actually mean that Prakrit is like a later spoken version of Sanskrit than classical Sanskrit? Or like what's kind of the relationship here?
It's not later per se, but let me continue this story of the development of
Yeah,
Sanskrit from where
please
we
go
were
ahead.
left
I don't
off
want
with
to derail you
Panini,
so much. Yeah.
and then while explaining while I'm continuing, I'll get into Prakrit and Pali and
Yeah,
explain
thank
how they
you.
relate to Vedic and the whole Indo or not the whole Indo-European family, but the Indo-Aryan family. So
I'm just too impatient. I'm just jumping in.
oh
No, please
no
continue
no
the
I mean the
story.
points yeah the points
Yeah.
that you raise I think are essential for understanding how far we've gotten so far.
Mm,
And so yeah, Panini, he's around yeah, maybe the third or fourth century before the Common Era. Um and so after Alexander the Great, he came to India around the 320s BCE, I believe. Might have that a little bit off, but about 50 years later, there was an emperor called Ashoka, and
Oh, it's
Ashoka
one of my
was
favorite guys. I like
oh yeah
Ashoka. Yeah. Please, please continue. I just want to
yeah
appreciate, just share my
sure
appreciation for
yeah.
Ashoka. Very interesting character. Yeah.
So his father Chandragupta Maurya almost united all of India, and Ashoka essentially finished the job with the conquest
Mm,
of Kalinga. And Ashoka, out of remorse for all of the killing he had done and all sorts of other terrible things that he's supposed to have done, he decided to or resolved to become a Buddhist, according to the Buddhists, according to the Buddhist account,
mm,
and he established edicts. They're called rock edicts around India,
mm.
and essentially we use these rock edicts to figure out how far Ashoka's rule reached. So it reached almost to the southern tip of India, and it reached north to essentially modern day Nepal, and even further to the northwest of modern day India. And on these edicts are written instructions for people to, for example, build rest houses, protect animals, uh, uphold good conduct, protect brahmanas and shramanas, so essentially ascetics. And so essentially, he's trying to express, or he's trying to project his power. This is kind of
Mm.
soft power, by saying he's this great righteous king who rules by the Dharma, and
Well, the
these are all the
protect
rules you
animals
should
thing
follow.
is interesting. I don't think I've heard of a
Yeah.
protect animals edict that was quite so, because we're talk. So what's the time period roughly that we're talking about now
So
with
to
Ashoka?
seven, yeah, to around roughly around 270 BCE to around
Okay,
240 or so, give or take 5
okay,
years either way. I can't quite
yeah,
remember the
yeah, yeah.
exact dates, but I think he was
Mm.
enthroned 267 BCE.
Okay.
Um, so the language, so this is very interesting because these edicts, they're written in a script which appears to have developed from scripts that they may have encountered through trade. Um,
Oh,
yeah, and so it is related to um, it is related to uh, sorry, the name's escaping me. Begins with a P. Phoenician, the
oh,
Phoenician
wow. So,
script.
but
Yeah,
so you by that you mean because Phoenician developed in the Greek the Greek alphabet developed out of Phoenician.
yeah,
And the Latin alphabet was developed from Greek, as I understand. So it's like,
right.
but then this is almost like another branch of that. So that do you mean that it's understood that it came from the Phoenician alphabet, rather than coming from the Greek alphabet, kind of thing,
Exactly. Yes, yes. So they
right?
both came from this common ancestor. And so this is
Mm,
a script we could call Proto-Brahmi. And so the oldest script that was used in, let's say, continental India was essentially the script which we call Brahmi. And
mm,
this is the ancestor of the modern Indian scripts, like Devanagari, that's used for
mm,
Hindi and Nepali,
mm.
and also the ones that we talked about on the Newar episode, the Nepalese scripts. They're all coming from this family, and the Tibetan script comes from this family. Um, it also seems to have some. So you mentioned the Korean script. I think it was King Sejong who created
That's right.
the Korean script. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, there may have been some connection there, but I can't say for sure.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's very long
So it had a
distance.
it had
Yeah.
a far reach, and
Mm.
yeah, and actually some of these scripts, like Siddham, which ended up being used for writing Buddhist incantations, became very popular in esoteric Buddhism in China, Korea, and Japan. So they were familiar with the way that these characters, which are called aksharas, were
Mm.
formed. These letters, and so what was written using the script on these rock edicts were the local languages which people, or something similar to the local languages that people would have spoken. And
Oh, because it needs to be understood by more or less
yeah,
ordinary people.
yeah.
Yeah.
But one of the things that this also tells us is that there must have been people who could read, because there's no point
Yeah.
making rock edicts if there's no one who can read them. Otherwise,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's just a pillar. Um, and so so writing probably was around for a little bit earlier than that, but we don't know how and in what form. But then what was written were these local languages, and right around Ashoka's capital, Pataliputra, they used a language which is referred to as Ardha Magadhi, which is an old form of Magadhi, this language from that region. And it's
Mm.
believed that that is close to probably what the Buddha spoke. The Buddha may have spoken a language similar to this Ardha Magadhi. And this
Right.
language is very similar to Pali and also the Prakrits. So now I'll explain what that means. So I already mentioned that Vedic Sanskrit and Classical Sanskrit, these are elite languages, and the Vedic scriptures were transmitted orally by an elite class of priests. This is not a common language that people were speaking, although there are some scholars who claim that Sanskrit must have been spoken. But the populace would have spoken languages which developed alongside Sanskrit, but which were simpler in pronunciation and simpler in grammar. So, for example, where Sanskrit has uh, complicated um, ways of ending and starting words if they come together, which is called sandhi, which is very similar to French.
Ah,
Liaison, is it liaison?
yeah, 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 yeah. Liaison, yeah. The
Liaison, yeah.
yeah,
I
just like
mentioned that my
when
French is not very good because
when
I'm
two, yeah.
Canadian.
Yeah. Yeah, you get this general term in linguistics for when you put multiple words together, you end up pronouncing them differently. So
Yeah,
I'm actually, if anything, I'm slightly more familiar with tone sandy. So it's the same idea, but for tones in tonal languages.
yes.
So Mandarin has a very small amount of tone sandy. Hokkien has an absolutely just like terrifyingly complex tone sandy. It's another Chinese language. But so in Mandarin, for example, there's a flat tone and a falling tone. If you say something like 一到五, which means like 1 to 5, like one or 1 through 5 if you're American, then typically most Mandarin speakers would, rather than keeping the E flat, they will tend to make it rise. So it'd be like 一到五, like this. And it's kind of this sense that it's easier to say, I suppose, right? That's the justification. But like the reality is basically it's just the way people speak, that they won't completely rigidly hold to the tone, irrespective of context. It will change. So another thing is, yeah, this falling tone, you wouldn't tend to put two in a row. I'm trying to think of a sentence, like, off the top of my head while I'm speaking English, thinking of a sentence in Mandarin that has two falling tones in a row. So you got like 事件, which means event. A lot of people would a lot of people might like raise the tone instead. So it would be like, instead of 事件, they might say like 时间, which is like 时间, like this, instead of 事件. So this is a tone, technically they should be pronounced 是 and 见, but then like, it's common for people to actually raise one. So that's an example of tone sandy. It's like the tones depend on what context they're in. And yeah, the French example would be something like, il fait would be like he does. But then if you're asking a question like whether he does, you change the order and be like fait-il. And this T turns up because it's in the writing. So it's like a kind of historically the T was there. It disappeared. Like you don't say it anymore normally. But then there is this special context where you have a verb afterwards, a vowel afterwards that you would actually pronounce the T. So yeah, anyway, this is a couple of examples of Sandy. So I suppose I understand you were saying that there's something similar going on, but rather complex in Sanskrit.
Yeah. Oh, it's very complex. There are lots of rules. So there is such a thing as internal and external sandhi. So, for example, if you make a compound word out of two originally separate words, then you do have to make sure that it's easy to pronounce. So, so speakers of modern Indic languages will know the term svagata or svagatam, which means welcome. So this comes from su, which means good, and agata, which means come. So literally, well, come.
Yeah, yeah.
But
It's like
yeah,
English, yeah. Or
but if you say
bienvenue.
su, yeah, but
Yeah.
if you say su agatum or su agata, then you either have to you have to stop before you begin the next word, or you have to change the sounds. So instead of saying
Mm.
su agatum, you say spagatum. So before a becomes va,
Hmm, hmm.
and then that's internal sandhi, and then external sandhi. would be something like one of the common. I won't. Maybe I don't know if you want to get into cases, but the nominative case ending in the masculine is it's this schwa with a puff of air, which is called a visarga. Aha. So, for example, if Buddha is the subject of a sentence, you'd say Buddha, Buddha.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And so, if you say the Buddha went to the forest, if you say it without sandhi, you'd say Buddha vanam gachati. But Buddha vanam is supposed to be hard to say, so you'd actually say Buddho, Buddho va, and instead of saying vanam gachati, you'd say
Mm-hmm.
vanang gachati. So the
And becomes
labial M becomes a nasal
right.
And so this is external sandhi. Pali and Prakrits usually simplify a special internal sandhi. It depends. Sometimes they have it. Sometimes they retain those forms. Sometimes they get rid of them. So, for example, uh, sometimes they even simplify things which are not from sandhi. So, for example, most people will know the term dharma, which means the teaching of the Buddha or the law. In Hinduism, it often means duty. There are so many. There's probably 20 definitions of dharma,
Mm.
but that's supposed to be hard to pronounce for ordinary people. So in Pali and many Prakrits, they'd say dhamma, dhamma,
Mm-hmm.
bodhisattva, a being who is aiming for awakening, is not a bodhisattva, but a bodhisatta. It's easier to say
Okay.
satta than sattva, for
So,
example.
so at the moment, what we're getting into here is this is how Prakrit differs from Sanskrit.
In terms of
Is this the
uh, in terms of internal pronunciations, and then for the
right?
external, in terms of external sandhi, they would they would not bother to either have or not have um, a certain form that changes. They would just solidify it into one form. So they always apply the sandhi. So, for example, instead of the nominative sometimes being buddha and sometimes being buddho, it would always be buddho. And
Mm.
so what is a prakrit? Essentially, a prakrit is a written or formalized form of these more colloquial or more popular forms of speaking Indo-Aryan languages. And so even Prakrits are are um, are constructed languages. Sanskrit Sanskrit is in many ways considered a constructed language. Um,
Oh,
yeah, Sanskrita itself means constructed, put together. It also means perfect, but it means put together. Because essentially Panini defined the rules of classical Sanskrit, and so if you wanted to write Sanskrit, you'd have to learn the rules, and you'd have to write it according to the rules, and so it
this
was
is so
a
weird.
yeah.
This is so weird. This is like a made up language, but the
But it does
language of the
come from
Vedas
yeah. That's what
was that
I
not?
want
Did
to
no one
say
ever
is
use that language in the past? I mean, they call it Sanskrit as well.
yeah. That people would have spoken very similar. They would have colloquially spoken something very similar to Vedic, and at a certain point, people probably would have colloquially spoken something very similar to classical Sanskrit. But in very large space, people have different ways of pronouncing things in different regions.
Yeah, there has to be
This
some
might have
regional
some,
variability.
and this also has something to do with other
Oh,
languages that Sanskrit
wait.
encountered.
I
Yeah.
think I have the analogy. Oh, I was trying to reach for an analogy, but the analogy I want to reach for here is Arabic. So
Okay.
then we have, I mean, even modern Arabic, right? People think Arabic, yeah, Arabic is Arabic, but in fact, again, not being this is very much, I'm a jack of all trades here. This isn't my specialty, um, but Arabic is actually quite different. If in different regions you have Levantine Arabic and Moroccan Arabic and Egyptian Arabic, and each of these is not really so mutually intelligible, in fact. But there is modern standard Arabic, and modern standard Arabic holds on to some kind of slightly archaic ways of expression and grammar, but it's used in formal situations like like if you see someone telling the news on TV, presenting the news, they will use modern standard Arabic rather than whatever the people actually normally speak. So that sounds a little bit like this because it is this kind of quote unquote fake language. It's kind of like, not fake, but it's kind of like they decided that this sounds more formal, so this is what they're going to go with. But nobody actually uses it. They just use it in order to sound formal. I mean, I think as far as I understand, I'm not a, I'm not an Arabic speaker, so it's hard for me to confirm. But as far as I understand, things like books and newspapers will typically more often be written in I might get this wrong, but my understanding is that they'll more often be written in modern standard Arabic than in one of the kind of more spoken varieties, let's say, of Arabic. So that sounds a little bit potentially similar, because also there is a history of, in the Caliphate and sort of earlier centuries of the Middle East as a whole, there is a history of Arabic being used as similar to Latin as a kind of lingua franca for the educated people, including for people who aren't Arabic speakers in terms of their native language. So Persians would use Arabic to write treatises if they want to write about typically, maths or medicine or whatever other, astronomy, whatever other brainy stuff they want to do. They would use Arabic in a similar way that you'd use Latin in Europe. And so, that I imagine, again, is slightly, I haven't got the full lowdown on the story, but I imagine that the Arabic of those manuscripts had a level of standardization everywhere, so everyone was using the same rules to write, so that people knew what other people were talking about, and people knew how to express themselves. And with that analogy, maybe Sanskrit, with this idea that perhaps it wasn't really used, but it was a standardization that people applied, which was essentially kind of like a slightly archaic, kind of like a median sort of like decision on what Prakrit features we should use, plus like standardize. In that sense, I can understand it, because otherwise my go-to thought would be like, yeah, it was just a stage in development of the history. Whereas what you've now described, at least as far as classical Sanskrit is concerned, sounds like a deliberate attempt at standardization in order to be able to communicate with one another in written form. Am I right?
Well, people would have learned how to speak it, but it would have been something that you would have had to have learned in a school setting. And so,
Mm.
for example, formal debates, especially at court, if you come before a king and the king asks, okay, this Buddhist monk, please debate with this Samkhya philosopher. Samkhya is a school of Indian philosophy, a non-Buddhist school of Indian philosophy, or this Mimamsa philosopher. They would have to do the debate in Sanskrit, so they'd have to have a level of expertise to be able to 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 come up with Sanskrit on the spot, and also in verse. This is also something which is not very common today, but this is something.
On the
And
spot.
oh yeah, and actually people who have studied oral cultures have documented that this is a feature of oral cultures, that uh, spontaneous construction of verse is much more common in oral cultures. And although it was not a culture where people were 100% oral, orality was essentially, or when literacy came in, it was being used as a support for a continued oral tradition. And so
Mm.
we have something which the literary theorist Walter Ong calls secondary orality. So primary orality is when you have an oral tradition without any support of literature. Nobody has learned how to
Mm.
read. Nobody has learned how to write. Secondary orality is when writing has been introduced, but there's still some kind of oral tradition which continues. But that oral tradition is changed and influenced by writing. But nonetheless, there can be an oral tradition that continues. But the character does change. Um,
Mm.
and so the situation that you described with Arabic, this standard Arabic, would be a very good analogy for Sanskrit if it were not for Prakrit and Pali and these other languages, because what we have with Prakrit is another constructed language, which is closer to the way that ordinary people would have spoken, which would have been used uh, simultaneously. And so it's as if you had a culture where people would learn, standard Arabic, and also learn Latin, and use it in different domains. Prakrit doesn't is not supposed to sound formal at all, actually.
Oh, right.
So yeah, and so for example, in a drama, Sanskrit drama, in classical Sanskrit, if the character is a brahmana, a brahmin, or a kshatriya, they will speak classical Sanskrit. But if the character is, unfortunately, if they're a female or if they're a low caste, they will
Mm.
speak Prakrit to make them sound a little bit more uh, low class. Sorry to
Lower
say, but
class.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
This is the idea. But there's very beautiful poetry written also in Prakrit, and so it also became a very a language, an elite language you'd have to learn, you'd have to study in order to write properly. So what is Pali? Pali is very similar in this sense to Prakrit. Uh, it was probably, I think the leading theory is that it was probably a language that was spoken in the southwest of India, which then became the language that was used to transmit Buddhist texts, a constructed language that was used to transmit Buddhist texts to Sri Lanka. But it was very similar to it's very similar to the language that would have been spoken in the northeast of India, or to Magadhi. And so if you can read Pali and you know another Prakrit from that time, like Sharaseni, which is more of a central Prakrit, then
Mm.
you won't have much trouble understanding other Prakrits. So if you know Sanskrit and one Prakrit, then it's quite easy to jump to other um, Indo-Aryan languages, um,
S- So is
whether
Pali
living or
kind of
dead.
is Pali a Prakrit?
You could say that, yeah, you can categorize it as a Prakrit, uh, but
Mm.
but later on in the first millennium of the Common Era, the term Prakrit comes to have a very formal meaning and refers to one of a number of very specific kinds of Prakrits.
Mm.
So there's this broader term Prakrit, which is sometimes used rather loosely, um, into which you could probably lump Pali. But then, if we're talking about later on in the first millennium, later in the first millennium, um, then it starts to become even more formalized. Uh, but essentially, what both Pali and other Prakrits and Sanskrit become in different domains for different classes and in different regions, they become what you could refer to as a lingua franca. So this means a language that people who may speak their native language or a mother tongue might be a regional language that people in other parts of India would not understand, but they have this common language that they can use to communicate with people in other parts of India or other parts
Mm.
of the Buddhist world. In the case of Pali, it's used for
Mm.
uh, what is sometimes painted with a broad brush as Southern Buddhism, so Sri Lankan, Thai, Burmese Buddhism. They all use Pali rather than Sanskrit.
Mm.
And then there are other kind of Prakrits, these formalized language. Well, we don't really know how formalized they were, but some of them even reach up into Central Asia. So Gandhari, which essentially was spoken in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent and even into Central Asia, so Afghanistan, and it goes quite close to it gets quite close to the western border of China, and so the term that was
Which language
used
is that
in
that you mentioned? The Afghan, the one that
Gandhari,
we said. Sorry,
Gandhari.
Gantari. Okay, I haven't heard of this one.
So Gandhara was this region, and this was a region which also was settled by Greeks, and so
Oh,
this
Bactria.
this
No.
exactly, yeah, Bactria.
Yeah.
So this is sometimes referred to as the Indo-Greek Kingdom. Um, And then there are lots of things going on in Central Asia that we can't really get into, but Sanskrit spread with both with Buddhism and with Hinduism, and so there's this term that the scholar Sheldon Pollock uses to refer to this phenomenon. There's this term which we use, which is the Sanskrit cosmopolis. That's
Mm.
to say, people usually think of Sanskrit as something from India, but in fact, Sanskrit was an essential part of the cultures, of course, Nepal, we know that, but also these Central Asian kingdoms, which were Buddhist kingdoms. They would have
Yeah.
had a mixture of Buddhism, Hellenic religion, and Zoroastrianism, and then also East Asia. It spread through the Silk Road.
Mm.
Sanskrit was used for religious purposes in Chinese Buddhism, and Sanskrit also spread into Southeast Asia, and so
Mm.
In Cambodia it was quite widespread, and Indonesia, and so
Mm.
Indonesian Hinduism and Buddhism used Sanskrit, and they were known as major center. Cambodia and Indonesia were known as major centers of Sanskrit culture.
That's a
So
really
it was a massive
widespread.
cosmopolis. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
exactly.
a really widespread. Go all the way to Indonesia. That's a long way away. And yeah, I guess this is another just interesting aspect of history that I think is I imagine is not widely recognized. Or, there's a lot of people who don't know about this, about the kind of cultural and religious changes that have happened in Central Asia, for example. I think Indonesia is probably also another case, but I just don't know almost anything about that case in particular. But the how in Central Asia, Buddhism was really big. It was the top religion, and then Islam came after that, and it was it became uh, dominant. The dominant religion in the area became Islam, but previously, prior to that, it was Buddhism, and it had a very wide spread in the area. I mean, there's lots of, Central Asian history in general is. There's a really good book about it called Lost Enlightenment. Every time I say it, I almost say Lost Entitlement, but it's just for some reason. But yeah, Lost Enlightenment by, I think his name is Frederick Starr. Very thick book, but a really interesting book about Central Asian history, and it brings the Greek geographer Strabo. He said the land of 1,000 cities, known to be very rich, and he was referring to Central Asia. He was referring to what's modern day Uzbekistan mostly. That's where the land of where algebra was first formalized was Khwarizm, which again is sort of roughly modern day Uzbekistan. Like, people don't think of Uzbekistan as some kind of like major center of wealth and culture, but in fact it was, just like not in a period that most people are paying that very much attention to historically. So yeah, this widespread of Buddhist culture is interesting in its own right. This podcast is about language rather than that specifically, but yeah, just an interesting point for people to realize. So that would make sense why Sanskrit would have an impact in those places as well as the most famously on the Indian subcontinent, but as you say, more widely, in fact.
Yeah. Um, and and so people would be able to benefit from the learning from in very wide fields, um, from India all the way to Indonesia, and it's very much like these days. People, if you publish in English, you can be guaranteed that you'll have a larger audience because many people study
Mm,
English as a second language, even if it's not their first language, and it would have been the same kind of situation. And actually, Chinese has a similar function in what's called the Sinosphere. So
mm,
in Korea, before they switched to exclusively using the Korean writing system, and also in
mm,
Japan, Korean, Chinese characters uh, would have been the lingua franca. You could communicate across those three countries without any hindrance if you knew
mm,
Chinese characters, and so it would have been similar to Sanskrit for South and Southeast Asia and
mm.
Central Asia.
Prior to speaking to you, I hadn't realized the extent of this, but also, again, it seems analogous to some other cases in terms of Well, I'm not so much with the Sinitic, the Chinese example, but with both the use of Latin in Europe and the use of Arabic across, obviously, what's now the Arabic-speaking world, but also, say, Iran, for example. Um, this sense of Sanskrit spreading from what you're saying, primarily for religious reasons, and then also cultural more widely, as I understand. But then having these
Yeah.
political implications of being able to have people communicate with each other across very wide distances. In theory, it sounds like you could have someone from, you know, Afghanistan or something, go on a very, very long journey, end up in Indonesia, and still have people they could talk to because there's going to be someone there who's going to be conversant in Sanskrit. That's an amazing thing, to have this really wide breadth, that you have this language that can be used over. But yeah, I mean, did it have some kind of political implications as well? Because it sounds like this is primarily a religious and then somewhat otherwise cultural thing, the usage of Sanskrit across these different places.
Yeah. So actually, I mentioned the author Sheldon Pollock, and his research has touched on the political dimensions of that. So if we consider before the Common Era, it seems like in courts, that's to say in governing bodies, the assemblies that a king would hold, or a ruling assembly of a tribe, for example, they would probably be using the local language. So it seems like Ashoka, for example, would have been speaking with his ministers in Ardha Magadhi rather than Sanskrit. But in the first millennium, it starts to become the case that Sanskrit also becomes a courtly language and becomes spoken in courts. And so it actually becomes more popular in the first millennium to the extent that people are using it for conversation. But it still seems that people don't speak it as a mother tongue. In other words, parents don't teach it to their children. You still would have had to have learned it in school, but it is not. It wouldn't be that difficult if you spoke something like a Prakrit growing up. It's close enough. Um, but I should probably mention the breadth of literature that Sanskrit covers, because of course we have the Vedas, we have religious literature, and a lot of the literature that we find in Sanskrit is not religious, um, but is always connected in some way to religion. And so, for example, I think the biggest corpus of Sanskrit literature that most people will be familiar with will be the epic literature, poetic literature. This is referred to as kavya. Sometimes this is translated as epic or poetry, but this includes the popular narratives like the Ramayana, the story of
Mm,
Rama and Sita. I think many people in Britain might be familiar with that story, as well as um, the Mahabharata, which I already mentioned,
mm,
and Puranas. Puranas are also religious literature, but it's popular religious literature. That as Sanskrit became more popular, people would probably be able to understand most of what was being spoken about. And the Puranas are kind of these epic tales of deities, like, for example, Vishnu, Shiva, and Brahma, and these religious figures who may have had their origins in the Vedic corpus, the Vedic literature, but didn't really have personalities. The Puranas give them personalities, and they engage in deeds and have affairs and relationships with different people. They do amazing things, that involve the destruction and creation of worlds, and they're really, really, really profound.
mm,
But then we already mentioned Panini, so there is linguistic literature,
mm,
but there's also literature for kings. So this becomes very important as Sanskrit becomes a courtly language. So the manual for kings, essentially the the Sanskrit version of Machiavelli's The Prince, is the Artha Shastra.
Mm.
So Artha means purpose or goal. So this is referring to the purpose or the goal of the king. So how do
Mm.
you run a state? And Artha Shastra was written by I think his name is Kautilya, and there are lots of theories about who he was. He might have been associated with Ashoka, but that's actually a very nice read, even if you read it in translation.
Mm.
But then we have works on timekeeping, measurements of time. So
Oh,
Sanskrit has an extremely South Asian culture or Indic culture, Sanskritic culture, has an extremely intricate way of dividing time down to seconds, milliseconds, sub-milliseconds, and so forth. And
okay.
there's literature on that, and also on mathematics. So
Yeah.
I think many people might be familiar with the number zero being a very important contribution from South Asia to
Trigonometry.
the rest of the world. Yeah,
And
trigonometry.
there's a lot of like there's a lot of stuff that is actually quite complex mathematically,
Yes.
but also not, how to say it, it's kind of like a rabbit hole. Like, as in, it's not like you need this mathematics for applications, in basic physics or something. Like they're sort of like really niche, the kind of maths that mathematicians like, like very
Hmm.
niche and like there for the sake of the intellectual exercise and because of the beauty of the structure. There's a lot of stuff like that, like stuff to do with like really precise measurements of pi, or like,
Yeah.
but through reasoning, not through like drawing a big circle or something, and continued fractions, which is like fractions inside fractions inside fractions, and this kind of infinite, anything to do with infinity. There was a fair amount of consideration of infinity. Yeah, I mean, it's some pretty niche stuff that they did, but they really did some interesting work with that.
Some of some of this does have applications in things like what's called Shastra, which is architectural manuals. So, for
Mm,
example, for the creation of palaces and temples, and you have to have the
mm,
correct proportions and measure arches and things like this. Um,
mm.
but yeah, they do get to this Ganita Shastra literature, this counting literature or mathematical literature. It gets to really really not really usable extents, but there
But
is there
cool.
isn't. Yeah,
It's cool
definitely.
though.
Yeah,
Astronomy actually is a frequent place where you'd use
astronomy as well.
mathematics. I imagine that some of their mathematics, trigonometry especially, sounds like it could be useful in some of their astronomical work. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
astronomy was a very important is a very important place where yeah, mathematics. I'm not sure how it was how much it is applied, but it isn't. But at least what's called Jyotisha or Jyotish is astrology, and that's a very important art in ancient India and
Mm,
in Sanskrit. And most people would have to be familiar with. I mean, most people who are learned would have to know the basics of the planets and so forth. Uh,
mm.
I mean, even if you're talking about architecture, you have to be able to orient a building in the right direction, but also in relation to the stars, but also and the directions, the cardinal directions, but also know when to build. So building at an auspicious time, you can't
Yeah,
build at an unlucky uh, conjunct of the asterisms, for example.
yeah. Build on a lucky day, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another area of Sanskrit literature which many people these days may be familiar with is also Aryaveda. This
Mm,
is these Arya means longevity, and Veda
mm,
is science or knowledge.
mm,
So the science of longevity. So it's medicine, ancient Indian
mm.
medicine,
Oh,
traditional
like
medicine.
Ayurveda. People in Ayurveda, yeah. Ayurvedic medicine,
Yes,
right? Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
yes. Um, and then there's also drama, um,
Oh,
plays. one of the most famous ones, one of the earliest ones that was translated into English, the Abhigyata Shakuntalam. So the story of Shakuntala. I think it was translated by William Jones.
So this is an independent theatrical tradition of, say, I imagine it must be independent from, say, Greek. Everyone talks about Greeks inventing drama, but then I guess this is an independent tradition.
Yes.
Yeah,
Definitely. Yeah.
yeah. You mentioned
So
earlier
there's a lot of literature like that.
Sorry, you mentioned earlier the literature for princes. It's actually, it's not something I've ever really gotten into, but it's one of those things, when you would like to do it one day kind of things. So mirrors for princes, I think the technical term. Mirrors for princes is actually an entire field of literature which I barely hear anybody really speak about. But if you look on Wikipedia, you can find a list, and there's like hundreds of them. So a lot of them were written in Latin. A lot of them were written in, as you say, there were some written in Sanskrit, written in many different languages over the centuries. And I think it's really fascinating to see what different people have. And there's really big literature of things like this in, especially like strategy manuals in Chinese, often, very formal or sometimes ancient Chinese. Sun Tzu's Art of War is the most famous one, but there's so many of them. For some reason, I find them very fascinating, and I'd love to get into them more in future. But there's something, I don't know, there's something quite beguiling to me about sort of what ancient people thought, that it's almost like self-help from ancient times, kind of, but for kings.
Yeah.
specifically telling kings what they should be doing. For some, I can't explain why, but I find it very interesting that there is such a literature and there's so many different languages that it's in. So I have heard at some point that there was this one in Sanskrit. I imagine there might be several, and just some of them are more famous than others.
Yeah. Yeah, the Artha Shastra is probably the one you heard of. But yeah, that's an interesting term, mirrors for princes. I just looked that up, and yeah, it is a really interesting field.
So you would include Sun Tzu's Art of War and The Prince as both works of literature in that genre, I would say, but obviously from different time periods and different places.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that they emphasize different things. Different people have different ideas. It's not like they're all saying the same thing all the time. So for some reason, I find it really fascinating what people in the past used to think was good governance, or used to think was the right way to behave. Yeah.
And the Artha Shastra does get into strategy as well. So how to conduct a war appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
Another literature or field of literature for princes, actually, or courtiers, is one which many people might be familiar with, but they might not know that it fits within this literature, and that's what's called the Kama Sutra. So many
Oh,
people
right.
know about this. People think of it as a I mean, the stereotype is it's a sex manual, but
Yeah.
it's a manual on courtly love. So how to engage in proper courtly love, how to find a spouse, how to find how to arrange an appropriate marriage, and the different kinds of marriages. It gets into all of this. Of course, there's the very sensational
Yeah.
aspect which most people
The
know it
famous
for,
bit.
but this is
Yeah.
also courtly literature.
Mm. So
So
that's also written in
it's
Sanskrit.
yes, yeah, it's in Sanskrit,
Yeah.
and most of
The-
a lot of Sanskrit, a lot of Sanskrit poetry has what I guess we would call erotics, or
mm,
descriptions of various very stereotyped kinds of behavior, which is supposed to be like the ideal form of what is attractive. And these are described in very kind of stereotyped or standardized ways.
mm.
Kind of like motifs, and yeah,
The Heart Sutra is very famous. The Heart Sutra is also from Sanskrit, is it?
yes,
In Taiwan, you
that's
see it like
controversial
everywhere.
actually. So
In sorry, did you say controversial?
so yes, this is the Heart Sutra. Whether it was originally written in Sanskrit, whether it was originally compiled in Chinese, is a major topic of debate. But yeah, there is
Oh,
a
okay.
Sanskrit version. But
Right,
whether
right.
it was translated back into Sanskrit, or whether it was translated from Sanskrit into Chinese, is a matter of debate. But what the Heart Sutra is, and actually heart or Hridaya, is a term that's used in Buddhist literature to refer to a condensation. So the heart, the essence of a
Yeah, yeah.
topic, is the
Because it's
Hridaya,
very
the
short.
heart.
In the
Very short.
Mandarin
Yeah.
version, I literally on just as like a sort of a keepsake or a souvenir, I have it on my keychain. I have a like a little block, a keyring block, a wooden block, which has the entire Heart Sutra on it. And in readable
Yeah.
text, I mean, it's not, the text is small, obviously, the font is small, but it's large enough for me to read it. So you can fit the entire text on like you can probably fit the whole text on one piece of A4.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that it's a real, um, yeah, I mean, you can read the whole thing in like probably under 5 minutes. Yeah, like
Oh, even
between
shorter.
3 and 5 minutes or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe one
So I
minute
think I've
if you're
got a
reading
piece
fast.
of Sanskrit literature up here, actually. Oh, is this it? Oh, is this it? Oh no, that's a different one. No, because I got a couple of interesting. I
Well,
think it's this one. So on people,
oh, which
yeah.
one?
So this one, like, not, people listening to audio won't see what's
Oh, yeah.
happening, but I have the Jingang. Hang on, what's
Bolo
that
Bolo
character?
Mi.
It looks like Boro, yeah,
Bo.
Boro
Yeah.
Boro Mi Do. So Boro Boro Mi Jing. So this is the Diamond Sutra in Mandarin. Sorry, in like, well, I have to say in Chinese because it's in a very
Yeah.
Mandarin isn't exactly the right term for this. And it's in this incredibly beautiful cover.
Oh, it's very nice.
It's so beautiful. And then
Yeah.
inside, yeah, inside is it's all written on black paper. So it's like this, and it's written on black paper with golden characters. The characters
Oh,
are written
wow.
using
That's
golden
very
ink.
beautiful.
And
Yeah.
it's just the most incredibly beautiful book I've ever seen. I bought it. I mean, I would like to read it. I'd like to know, the Diamond Sutra. It's got also these really beautiful drawings
Oh, wow.
done with
That's lovely.
in gold with some sort of paintbrush in gold ink, or like a pen with gold ink, and it's just so beautiful. I can't go over it. And busy life, and you get distracted and you don't get around to it. But this is something that I would really, really want to actually. I think just imagine reading something with this kind of calligraphy. I mean, it's so incredible.
Yeah.
So it's a
It's
bit, now we're
beautiful.
talking about Chinese calligraphy and not about Sanskrit, but this is as I understand it, this is originally a Sanskrit text. And
That's
you
right.
get
Yeah, that
people.
one is.
This is probably literally the most expensive book I ever bought,
Oh, wow.
or close to it, because I think I spent the equivalent of about £100 buying this,
Yeah.
which I thought was like, to be honest, that's worth it. Like the quality of this edition is
Yeah.
ridiculous. But like, but you don't often buy books for £100. Um, Obviously, and I bought it in Taiwanese money, but yeah, it's so beguilingly. It's an incredibly ornamental thing, and that just shows the level of respect that people have for this document, essentially, for this piece of
Yeah.
literature. And yeah, so like, clearly Sanskrit literature is making a huge impact in, you know it still makes a huge impact in other languages, being translated like it is, like this, and carefully, beautifully crafted into such a piece of art. Really, I think it's really
Yeah.
wonderful thing. Yeah.
And that is
um
Sanskrit on the cover as well. Bolo Bolo Mi Do is
yeah,
means Pragya Paramita. It's a transliteration, which means perfection of wisdom.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so actually
So,
I do have a Heart Sutra here in Sanskrit. Um
mhm.
this is kind of the format. I mean, it the Chinese one is oriented you'd orient it this way, but the
Yeah,
Sanskrit
vertically. The
manuscripts
Sanskrit
or
will be
texts
horizontally.
are
Yeah,
written horizontally. And yeah, so this is a Heart Sutra, but it's printed. It's a kind of it's a printed edition. But essentially
mm.
the sutra is from here to here where my
Okay,
index
so yeah,
fingers
it's quite
are.
short.
So quite
It looks
short.
about the size of an A4 page.
Yeah,
So these books, interestingly, the format is the same. So these are not books as you would
that's what you
understand
want.
them from a kind of like a typical Western perspective that you have a bound volume where there are individual leaves stuck together on a spine. The way that these are put together, people, if you're watching video, you'll see them with your eyes. But to describe for people who aren't, they are like single sheets of paper that are very long and folded multiple times to make a kind of concertina, and then essentially you're reading like one giant piece of paper. In the case of the Heart Sutra that you just showed me, it's only the size of about one page. But this one that we were just talking about, the Diamond Sutra, is much longer than one. I mean, it is technically one page, but the actual length of it is probably measured in meters. I think it's probably like 2 or 3 meters long of a single piece of paper that you essentially just keep reading this one piece of paper. There's no turning of pages, technically speaking. It's just like one long piece of paper. So yeah, I hadn't considered that it might be a shared format of the way that these books are not compiled, but like the medium looks the same in terms of like both being in this kind of folded paper, single sheet of folded paper format rather than individual pages stuck together by a spine format.
Yeah, and actually, even in so there are different kinds of formats that we find. This has become kind of common in Nepal. So this is from
Mm.
Nepal, um, but the traditional way that manuscripts were assembled in India is they would use palm leaves, uh,
Mm.
which are or tala and talapatra, and dry them, cure them in some way so that it's easy to write on, and they would actually be stacked loosely on on top of one another with a wooden cover on the top and the bottom, and sometimes there would be a hole put through them, and a string would go through, so there'd be a string hole to keep them all together, and this is how they're
Mm.
still used in many in many temples and many houses even in South Asia,
Mm.
and yeah, still used on a daily basis like that.
What do they write with? Do they have a pen or a paintbrush or something?
Yeah, they'd use a stylus that there are lots of different ways of doing it, so it depends on the medium, but um essentially, so there are two different ways that it could be done. One of them is just writing directly onto the leaves. Another one is etching um uh I guess etchings or scraping away the top layer of the leaf and then rubbing the ink into the holes. So
Mm.
there are different ways of doing it.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
there
So
are also
yeah.
sorry,
Please go
I was
ahead.
just going to say that there are also black folio or black page manuscripts from
Mm.
South Asia with gold ink, very
So that's
similar to
similar also.
uh,
Yeah.
that.
It's very
Yeah,
beautiful. Gold on black
yeah,
is just an amazing way to read a book. It's so good. It's like reading a book in dark mode, kind of, but just it's something so rich. It's like you didn't realize you were missing it. Like the
yeah,
black page, it looks so much better than a white page. It just looks like it just automatically it's got this richness. And then the gold, yeah, it makes you really, I mean, it brings into relief, or it kind of like it concretizes this Mandarin saying. So it's the various forms of it, but it essentially says something like "一字千金," which literally means one character, like one word, essentially one word, 1,000 gold. It doesn't like gold pieces, let's say. So it's with, it's like saying that something's worth its weight in gold. It's saying like every word is worth 1,000 whatever gold pieces. So this idea of like the value of the writing is so great. You have that directly kind of concretized in the use of gold lettering to you wouldn't write a newspaper in gold lettering, right? This isn't like a throwaway or like this is a thing that's meant to last. This is a thing that's meant to demand a certain kind of respect, and I love it actually. I love that formatting. I love the fact that there's the option for it as well, that like we can have different ways of writing and it signifies something, which medium you use to write in. has a meaning, and brings you to a different state of mind. It's an aesthetic experience. I think this is something that people realize when we first started having ebooks and Kindles and stuff. We're like, oh, everyone's just going to use Kindles. No one's ever going to, people are going to read stuff on their phone. They're never going to read a book. And certainly people read on their phone a lot. Let's not say they don't, because they do, me included. People read stuff on their phones, but it's a different experience. It's not like books are going to disappear, because there's a different aesthetic experience, there's a different medium, and it brings you something, just any kind of paper. But then if you have who's going to replicate the feeling, the aesthetic appeal of gold ink on black paper? No one's going to. It's just not possible. It's too special. And actually, that's kind of a direction I wanted to go in now. A slightly similar direction is I wanted to ask you a little bit, because you are quite clearly, essentially, you've more or less dedicated your life to, among other things, to Sanskrit, and to the related culture and literature around that. Not only Sanskrit, of course, but that's been a major part of what you've been doing, and clearly you can't do that without a serious, you're not doing that willy-nilly. You've made a definite choice that that's what you want. And, one thing is, I think it'd be interesting for people to hear, why is this, why is this important to you? But then just also in terms of, people might say, well, if you want to know the literature, if the literature is the thing that is getting you excited, or that you want to know about, you could just read it in English. Someone could just translate it and you can read it. So I'd really like to hear, partly what is it that brought you to this, or what is it that has made you so interested or excited or dedicated to this? But on the other hand, also, when you read in Sanskrit versus had you only had contact with this literature through English, what's the difference for you? How does it feel? Or what does it bring you to be able to read it in the original text versus reading a translation?
Yeah, so I first got I first got interested in reading Sanskrit essentially because I wanted to read Buddhist literature. That was my original motivation. And because I got into Buddhism as a teenager, just at that age when people are children or teenagers are kind of questioning the meaning of life. Of course, I never found the meaning of life ultimately,
No?
but along the way, I encountered these different thought systems, and I wanted to read it in the original language. And the reason why was because I always felt like there were some texts that I would encounter, and I always felt like there was something that might be a bit deeper than what I'm reading in translation. And this
Mm,
goes to your second question. Um, every time you translate a text, you're interpreting a text. So translation is inherently interpreting. Some people think of translation as identifying the exact equivalent in one language and substituting it with the perfect equivalent in another. And anyone who understands how any kind of language works, it always depends on context. There's conversation, there's discourse that came before, discourse that will come after. There's spatial context. Where is the text located, or where are we having a conversation? All of these things change the reception a certain word will have at a certain time, or a certain way of phrasing a sentence will have. I can say I can present to you with a sentence which sounds slightly more formal, or I can give you a sentence which sounds ever so slightly more casual. And
mm,
these nuances are quite subtle, but they all depend on the context. And so this is probably why there are lots of these cliched phrases around translation, like um, uh, like well, in Italian, tradi, what is it? Traditore. I probably
mm,
butchered that. The translator is a traitor.
mm. Yeah,
Um, or poetry is what's lost in translation. These kinds of
yeah.
cliched phrases, I think they express a kind of awareness of this sense that a translation always seems to make something, or uh, always seems to cause something to drop away from the original. And I think that's not actually what's happening. I don't think something is being dropped away. What you're doing is you're expressing your interpretation in one language of what something is saying in another language, and that is what translation is. And so every time you read a translation of a text by somebody else, you're reading their interpretation. And so, take for example the Bible. How many translations of the Bible are there? In English alone, there must be 200. I'm not sure, but there's probably something near 200. And I don't
Yeah.
know if the people who are interested in translating Bibles are getting anywhere near a definitive edition or a definitive translation where they'll never have to translate again. There are people with
Mm.
different interests from different sects and subsects, which have a slightly different interpretation of this one line, and that will justify, an entirely new version of the whole thing.
Mm.
Um, so and so one text and one collection of texts, even one sentence, can be translated hundreds and hundreds of times, and every time it's slightly different. It has a slightly different interpretation, and each one is neither a correct or incorrect translation, but each one is a different interpretation of what the original said. Even if you drop something away or add something, it's always some kind of interpretation that maybe something is necessary to help people understand this text, or maybe this is not possible to explain in my language, so I want to drop this word away. So these are all judgments that a translator makes. And so in studying Sanskrit, I found this to be the case firsthand. Once you learn a language, you might find this with the languages that the second or third languages that you speak and read. When you read a translation by somebody else, it's never quite the same as your interpretation. And
Mm.
so a translator is never satisfied reading someone else's translations. And so what this ends up doing is creating or spurring on an addiction. And it's a good addiction. And especially if you're a professional academic,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's always fruit for future translation and research projects. But it's an addiction where every single text has an infinite number of ways that it can be interpreted. And this is something that, learning Sanskrit as one of the first language that I really got deep in. I started with, I did some Latin and some French, but didn't get too deep. Um,
Mm.
but Sanskrit was the first one that I really realized this is not only beautiful in and of itself, but it allows me to try and interpret this person for myself. But Sanskrit on its own right, if you just read it uh, in its own context, or uh, by itself in its own with its own meters and with its own rhythm. It's extremely beautiful, and I don't know if there's another language which really well. I mean, I don't know all languages, but I don't know if there's a rival. The metrical system is extremely complicated, and and not complicated in a. I don't want to give the sense that it's extremely extravagant or baroque. It's
Mm.
just very beautiful to listen to and to read. So yeah, that's something that I think people should find appealing,
Mm.
and it opens the door to so many other areas of study, be it just within Sanskrit, or for example, if you're interested in Buddhism, if you learn Sanskrit before tackling Buddhist Chinese, it helps a lot because you start to see this is kind of a strange thing to say, but you start to see the Sanskrit behind the Chinese. And
Yeah.
you understand the transliterations. You can understand, oh, why did they structure these clauses like that? So it's because it's a translation from Sanskrit. It's not, the clauses are not structured like Lao Tzu or Confucius. It's a very different
Mm-mm.
kind of literature.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
opens lots of doors.
Yeah. So you mentioned before we started recording, you mentioned that, or I asked you actually, and you said that you are in fact yourself a Buddhist. So I'm interested in your contact with the original language texts in Sanskrit, but also you do so in Newar and some other languages. Has that affected your kind of effectively your spirituality or your practice as a Buddhist?
Well, I would say it's pretty much my primary practice. I'm not
Okay.
as diligent a meditator or a ritual practitioner as some people might be.
Mm,
And I think a lot of people who have the uh, you know, the same approach to Buddhist studies as myself end up in the same kind of situation where we find most of our time is spent reading texts, and that's more or less how we engage with practice. But I do have some religious practice separate from that. I go to a temple in Tokyo here,
mm,
but and yeah, there there if you go to a temple, an organized center, it's not necessarily going to have a major impact on what you do in those kinds of environments, but your understanding will definitely be enriched if you study Sanskrit or classical Chinese or other languages.
mm,
Um, and the another thing is you start to understand the implications, many implications that a certain word may have. So, for example, uh, in Buddhism, let's say, for instance, we talk about. Just trying to think of a good example. Uh, let's say wisdom. So the
mm,
English term wisdom, it has a sense. It has a sense of something that's kind of deeper than just knowledge.
mm,
Uh, but uh, but in Sanskrit, the term is pragya, and the root of this is gya, and the term that we would usually translate as knowledge is jnana, and this is a
mm,
cognate of the Greek uh, gnosis. In English, we'd say gnosis or gnosis, and this
mm,
is also a cognate of the English knowledge.
mm.
And so pragya, this pra is just an intensifier. Um, it it just makes it a kind of higher knowledge. And
Yeah.
so when you understand these kinds of when you have an understanding of the vocabulary in this sense, it really changes your connection to these kinds of ideas, because wisdom is very different. Wisdom kind of makes it a little bit too unapproachable.
Mm,
There are some other things which understanding the grammar and vocabulary has also had an impact. It has also impacted my understanding. So, for example, in Buddhism, there's something called the 12 links of dependent origination. Not to get too into the weeds, but this is
mm,
essentially a set of 12 aspects of our not only everyday experience, kind of psychological components of our experience on a day-to-day basis, but also a way of explaining how a sentient being, a living being, is reborn and lives from life to life throughout their whole life, from a past life, present life, a future life, but also a day-to-day level. But within the, and this is actually talking about Pali, but the same thing applies to some Sanskrit expressions of it. But um, within this set of 12 links, it switches from passive to active at a certain point. And
mm.
this is something you'd only notice if you read it in Sanskrit or Pali.
Because it's a
And what this
grammatical
sign,
feature, yeah, grammatical change.
yeah. So the passive is something that just in this context, I'll just to make it brief, this is something which is happening to you. You don't have agency over whether it's happening or not. Um, so for example, your condition. Let's say, for example, um, contact with the sense bases. So let's say contact with the eye to the eye object, a visible form, for example, gives rise to feeling. Now, I express that
Mm,
actively, but you could say passively feeling is arisen with the sixth sense basis as a condition, something like that. That would be a passive way of expressing it.
Mm.
And I don't know, I can't remember the exact way that it's expressed, but at a certain point it switches to the active. And what this signifies is actually where we have control. So in
Yeah.
Yeah, so where we can actually intervene in this process. So for most people, this process, which results in our own suffering, essentially, we engage in contact with things in the world. We develop attachment and we crave for them. And when we can't get things that we crave, that gives rise to suffering. It gives rise to dissatisfaction.
Mm.
That's a very basic overview. But there is a point in this cycle where we can actually intervene, and that is expressed in the active
Mm.
form. And so that's actually with craving.
Mm.
So craving arises, and we can either this might sound a little bit like Stoicism, but you can either assent to it or let it pass. Uh, but
Mm.
if you give into it, if you assent to it, then that will give rise to secondary craving. It will give rise to attachment and
Oh.
addiction. So this is a way of expressing it that sounds very it might sound very technical, but when you see that grammatically and you see it expressed in that way, it does change fundamentally your understanding of that particular idea. And so there are lots of things like this where understanding you could say the original language. There's debate over whether Sanskrit or Pali or Prakrit is the original language, but understanding it in a language from the source culture. Uh, it gives you a much richer understanding of these ideas and leads to a much deeper appreciation of what they can mean for you in your life.
Mm. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's particularly notable how it's literally a grammatical feature that helps you
Yeah.
understand the kind of original intended meaning. It's not just the translation of words, but you need to see the grammatical structure to get what's going on there. Um, yeah, just one thing briefly I'd like to touch on before we finish is the modern significance or modern attempts to actually speak Sanskrit again. Have you heard anything about that? I've heard that's a little bit of a thing people are trying to do.
Yeah, there are spoken Sanskrit workshops and I think even retreats. So you can go to some of these workshops that might be or intensives that take place over several weeks. Um, So yeah, these are attempts to kind of revive it as a spoken language. I already mentioned that it was never really spoken as a mother language by people or a mother tongue by people, but it was always something that people would have learned. It was a learned language, a language of the literati. So this is kind of in keeping with that. And so if you go to one of these kind of seminars or workshops, then you'll be able to get a more firsthand understanding of or a greater understanding of Sanskrit, I think. And I've never done this, but I know several people who have been to these workshops, and they do have a much better grasp of Sanskrit than when they started. So being
Yeah.
able to internalize it and memorize, whether even if it's just memorizing verses, for example, it does improve your understanding quite a lot. So there are some debates over whether this is its own thing or whether we can call it classical Sanskrit, because there are some things that I think I mentioned maybe in the Newar talk that we had, um, where it differs from classical Sanskrit, or the way that people use it ha, ends up differing in some ways. So, for example, Sandhi is sometimes simplified. Sometimes you'll hear people don't apply all of the Sandhi rules correctly, as they probably would have 1,500 years ago. And then
Mm.
another thing is the verb often doesn't need to be used in Sanskrit. So, for example, you can
Asti or
have
whatever it was.
sorry,
Is it the
asti.
word the
Yeah,
copula, like the word for is, right?
the copula, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
the word for is. So, for example, you can have two nouns in apposition, and it would be clear to anyone who knows Sanskrit that this means A is B.
Mhm.
right? Um, so
But
let's
people make it
say,
more like English because
yeah,
they insert the word is where it would normally
yeah,
not appear there in
they make it
classical Sanskrit. Yeah.
they make it more like English by adding by having the copula when it would usually be unnecessary. Um, so um, yeah, this is something that you might sometimes observe. I've met some people who have really perfect spoken Sanskrit, and it's very beautiful. Um,
Oh, really?
so there are lots of variations, but yeah, it's very impressive when people uh, can can just speak off the cuff. But yeah,
Yeah.
my interaction with Sanskrit or my use of Sanskrit is mostly academic and as a classical language.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't talk about. Some people talk about Sanskrit as a dead language, but we shouldn't talk of it as a dead language or a dormant language. It's an active language. It's a living language that people use every day for ritual purposes, and some people speak it. So it's a very vibrant language.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
thank you so much, Alexander, Dr. Alexander, for being with us again today to speak about Sanskrit and Prakrit and Pali also a bit.
yeah.
Um, thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
That was Panglot World Languages, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Panglot World Languages podcast. My company, Panglot Languages, makes learning resources, including language learning apps, for lower resourced languages. Our mission is to make high-quality learning resources for as many languages as we can, treating each language and culture with the respect it deserves. We use a combination of linguistics, the science of learning, and our own decades of experience learning and teaching languages to produce highly effective apps and other products to teach exactly the kinds of languages you hear about on this podcast. You can find out more about our work by visiting our website at www.panglotlanguages.com. I hope you have a great day.